as you can see with those courts which Manjula discussed with you, when we spoke about our district courts, it was one specific amount, so we moved from 200,000 to 600,000. So as you can see, as you start climbing up the hierarchy and you get to the higher courts, then more maximum fines can actually be imposed. And that's why knowing the hierarchy of your courts is actually important. Now, our superior courts, we've done inferior courts, we're moving on to our superior courts, which is our high courts, right? And essentially, the most important point that you need to remember about this is that they create precedent. In other words, the lower courts, which we've discussed earlier, have to follow the precedent which is set by these courts there themselves. These courts are also bound by its own previous decisions unless it's overruled by the higher court, which would be your Supreme Court of Appeal or your Constitutional Court itself. Now, what are the types of superior courts that we have? We have our high courts, and we have the specialized court like your labor court, and then we have the Supreme Court of Appeal and your Constitutional Court itself, which also falls under the category of your superior courts.
Okay, so now we're going to look at our first higher courts. So just like Cindy mentioned, we have 4 categories: your high courts, your specialized courts, your Supreme Court of Appeal, then your Constitutional Court. So here we need to look at the presiding officers again. Here we have judges. We don't have magistrates or commissioners, we have judges, with the judge president as head of each high court. Jurisdiction only over its own specific province. We have a high court in Durban. We also have one in Pretoria. We have it in all the provinces. Some provinces, like Johannesburg, for example, have 2 high courts. They have a local and a provincial division. They have the Johannesburg local and the provincial one in Pretoria. So in total, again, you conduct the research and you need to tell us in total how many high courts we have. But remember, they only have jurisdiction in that specific province. Okay, the high courts have provincial and local divisions. Both have the same powers, except locals can't generally hear appeals. All right, doesn't mean they can't. It means that some cannot. All right, they have the capacity to hear both criminal and civil cases. You know what's important here? Remember, as you go higher, the court has more power and is stronger. So there's no way a high court won't be able to hear both civil and criminal cases if a magistrate court can. So the logic follows. They also review and hear appeals from inferior courts. They also hear constitutional matters, but sometimes need that specific order that they've made to be confirmed by the high court. Remember, we spoke about exclusive jurisdiction. So for example, when a piece of legislation has been invalidated by the high court, the Constitutional Court has exclusive jurisdiction to confirm that order, for example. All right? And they also have inherent jurisdiction, and this again, power to regulate its own rules and regulations, unlike a magistrate court, which is confined to certain rules.
Okay, so sentencing in high courts is limited to life imprisonment, which is important as well in terms of understanding the maximum fine that can be imposed. Because remember, in South African law, due to our constitution as well and our important right to life, you cannot sentence anybody to any harsher type of fine. So they are bound by the high courts are also bound by their own previous decisions, but a high court is not bound by judgment of another high court. Okay, so if this specific high court wants to deviate on a particular type of matter from another decision made by another court, they can very well do so, right? But they need to consider the decision of the other court as persuasive authority. In other words, they don't need to follow it, but they need to read their judgment and see, well, what was the magistrate concerned about? What were the important aspects that he took into account in his decision? And let that lend itself to their decision, so the decision they end up making could be different, but it is a more informed decision.
Right, so now we're going to look at the specialized courts that we mentioned earlier. They're on the same level as all your high courts and therefore have the same powers as a high court. They hear specialized cases. For example, your labor courts, if you have a labor dispute, you would go to the labor court or the income tax court or the water court. They deal with that specific specialized matter.
Now we deal with a very important court. That is our Supreme Court of Appeal, which is known as our appeal court. Now this court itself, we only have one of, and it's sitting in Bloemfontein, right? And it's the highest court for appeal matters, except, of course, Constitutional Court, because the Constitutional Court is above the Supreme Court of Appeal. Right? Back to our hierarchy, which we spoke about at the beginning. Now, the presiding officer in this Supreme Court of Appeal, right, we refer to as the president of the court, right, and as the head of the Supreme Court of Appeal. So he would make all of the decisions concerning to this particular court itself. The jurisdiction now, important for the Supreme Court of Appeal, is all over the country in appeal matters. And remember, very importantly as well, because this is an appeal court, it is not a court of first instance. Okay? So in Latin, we'd refer to that as being not a court a quo, because the court a quo will only be the courts that hears the matters for the first time. And these type of our courts now, if you've been following, will be your magistrate's court and it will be your high courts itself. So they would hear the matter first. And if there's a problem, if there's some sort of a confusion about how the law was interpreted, etc., then the matter would come to the Supreme Court of Appeal because it's a matter of appeal. Right? Now, this court also has the capacity to hear appeals on both criminal cases and civil cases. And a good example of the criminal case which was taken on appeal is that of the Pistorius case. All right? So you can go back and read up on that to find out how appeals worked in that particular regard. Now, the Supreme Court of Appeal also has limited jurisdiction on constitutional matters, but it does not have the final say when it comes to constitutional matters itself. So the Constitutional Court can actually overthrow the decision made by the Supreme Court of Appeal as well.
What's important to note before we get into the Constitutional Court is that the High Court itself can also stand as an appeals court.
Mm-hmm.
So you can appeal to the High Court. And also when the High Court sits as a full bench, 3 judges, you have an appeal situation. So both the High Court, as a member, it's got inherent jurisdiction. This is a court of law, like Cindy mentioned, as well as an appeals court. So just take note of that. Okay, so the Constitutional Court, remember, this is the mother of everything. Remember, we said any law or conduct that's inconsistent with the Constitution can be declared invalid. Remember, this is the cornerstone of our democracy and our laws in this country. So the main function of the purpose is to uphold this Constitution. Remember, the Constitution is supreme. The presiding officers here, you have the Chief Justice, who's the head judge, you have the Deputy Chief Justice, and you've heard of these names in the media. All right? The Constitutional Court has no jurisdiction in non-constitutional matters, exception to the rule. Remember, in law we have the rule and the exception. Unless, of course, the matter is of general importance to the public, then they can take it to the Constitutional Court. But as a rule, it only hears constitutional matters, then we have the exception to the rule. It's the highest court for all constitutional matters. And remember how Cindy mentioned the right to life. The case that we look at there is S versus Makwanyane. This is the case that overturned because the supreme law of the country is now the Constitution. Before we had the death penalty. And because of this case, because the right to life is ultimately protected by the Constitution and fully protected by the Constitution, it then changed the decision. The facts of this case, I think it was 4 counts of murder, etc., and he was sentenced to death. And then in this case is where they said that the death penalty violated the Constitution because it violated the right to dignity. Because think about it, how painful. Yes, and the right to life more important. Yes, think about that person sitting there and waiting to be executed, and say that was degrading and it messed up with the dignity, and the right to life was of paramount importance. So this is where the decision was changed, emphasizing how important the Constitution is.
So now we look at the powers of our Constitutional Court, right? Now the Constitutional Court can invalidate any legislation which is in conflict with the Constitution. Very important. And this goes back to the example Mantua was talking about earlier, because to impose a death penalty meant that it was going to be in conflict with the Constitution's right to life. So immediately when that type of conflict happens, then the Constitutional Court has the power or the authority to actually invalidate that type of legislation. It can also order Parliament to change legislation to fall in line with the Constitution, and it can order state organs and individuals to stop or correct behavior that goes against the Bill of Rights itself. And there's quite a few examples we have if you've been reading and following up in terms of the media and what happens with our different politicians itself, that can lend itself to this argument. And of course, we'll discuss more with you on Edmodo and in class as well.
All right. Just like Cindy said, the Constitutional Court has final authority to decide whether an issue is constitutional or not as well. And all laws must fall in line with the Constitution. So that's how important this court is, because every law and every conduct must be in line with the Constitution. So just to recap quickly, we started off by looking at the judiciary. We said our judiciary is hierarchically established from the lowest court to the highest court. The higher you go, like Cindy said, the more power or authority that court has in terms of jurisdiction. You need to be able to, in a scenario, look at the scenario and then state which court has jurisdiction in that specific. Sometimes, remember we spoke about concurrent jurisdiction earlier, one or two courts may have jurisdiction in a particular case, but you need to be able to identify and point that out. The question is always why. Why have you chosen that specific court? So now you need to just go and look and see what jurisdiction each court has and be able to then apply that information in the scenario.
Right.